Technology today allows for us to send a sample off to a lab where they can test our DNA and send it back to us, and with all of the data they have, give us the percentages of our genetic makeup and where that geographically and ethnically that makeup comes from. I have not done this, but I know a few people who have, and almost all of them, when I talk to them, end up being a little bit surprised at some of the percentage that comes back in their profile that they get. There's something in there where part of the family story was never told in terms of who came from where, or maybe it's been so long ago that it's just disappeared from the family narrative. My dad grew up in a family that was what we thought 100% Norwegian. You could trace both of my grandparents' families back many generations into Norway. And I would not have been surprised one bit when my uncle got tested if it would have come back and said 100% Norwegian. But actually, it didn't say that. There came out to be some percentage of English and Irish, and whether that was from Viking raids across the sea or people who migrated across north on their own, some point long ago in our family's history, there were people from England and Ireland that came into that Norwegian space. And that percentage is there, and that was a surprise. Now, whether or not we are able to test our genetics doesn't necessarily tie into how we live as people of faith in the world. And wouldn't it be interesting if we could test our faith DNA and find out what our makeup looks like there? Today we hear a parable about weeds and wheat from Jesus, and like last week, we get an explanation of that parable. And that explanation says that the field where the seed is sown is the world, that the Son of Man sows good seed that are the children of the kingdom, or we might say the children of God, that the devil sows some other children that are the evil ones, and that the angels are going to come at the end and separate it out, and the evil ones are going to be all burned up so that the kingdom children can shine. Now, I wonder if what we could do is do some sort of faith test to find out what percentage of us are the good ones and which ones are the bad ones, or to test our own self and find out where we fall. Are we the good seed or the bad seed? Because I really struggle with this text for a lot of reasons. It would seem to imply, as Jesus explains it, that there are people in the world who are beloved children of God, who were destined to be that, and were good from the beginning. Whatever bad things they may do, we might be able to maybe discount, I don't know, because they are those good seed. And that there are other people among us who are not children of God, that they are just straight evil from the get-go, and whatever good they might have done in the world, we can also discount because they are the bad seed that was sown by the devil. Now, while we can certainly find examples of people who seem to be completely depraved and evil, I would bet that most of our experience of humanity is somewhere in the middle. We know those that are on the one end, the few that we might point at and say they are the terrible worst seed that there is, and we can point to people who we might say weren't perfect but brought great blessing into the world. But then I wonder if we could test our faith where the rest of us would fall. Because we as Lutherans would say that we are simultaneously saint and sinner. We are at the same time capable of great blessing and bringing good into the world, and of bringing hurt into the world and doing bad things that we might label as sinful. And so if we could test ourselves, would we say that if you're at 51% of blessing people, then you're the good seed, and if you're at 51% of doing harm, then you're the bad seed? We don't know, right? There isn't a test for this. And so we live with this tension that we are simultaneously saint and sinner, and we see around us all the time examples of this in the real lives of people. I think of the alcoholic who was unable to be a productive father or a husband, but whose friends would look at him and say what a blessing he was, the ways that he showed up in their lives right when they needed him. That was real blessing that he brought to them, even as he brought real pain to his family. I think of another guy who went through an awful divorce and in the process ended up with broken relationships with his children. He would show up and do anything you asked him to do. He was kind and he was gentle and he worked hard and touched many lives. but it had been several years since he had had any kind of meaningful conversation or contact with his own children. In that one person was this ability to serve and bless, and also an inability to live well into the relationships that he cared about the most. There was the woman who spent hours of days, of weeks, of months, of years dedicating her time to caring for the poor and struggling people in her community. And you could look and see the impact that she had in all of the work that she had done. But she could also sit down with you and say that she was really excited her children were moving so that her grandchildren didn't have to go to school with those little black kids anymore. She was capable of great blessing and also of carrying deep prejudice. When we say we are simultaneously saint and sinner, this is what we mean, that we as people carry both of these things at the same time. And I would bet that you can find examples in your own life. People that are close to you, people that are acquaintances, people that you have experienced great blessing from as well as great hurt. And as we begin worship each week with confession, we can maybe even look at our own lives and think of the places where we have fallen short, the relationships that we have done harm in, the people we have failed, the times we have not been honest, the times where we have not lived up to who we wish we were. And at the same time, though, as we confess those things, hopefully we can see the blessing that we are to other people, and the times that we have done good, and the times that we have gone out into the world and blessed people as we go along. Both of those things can be true. So when I hear Jesus talk about the seed of the good and the seed of the bad and the angels coming to separate it all out, I wonder how that's going to work, because what I see in human beings is both things tied, both us capable of blessing and capable of hurt. So when Jesus says those angels come, there's some bits of that I struggle with, right? Are we all going to end up on the side where we don't quite measure up? Can we do a test to measure that? And we know that we can't. Now, in the parable, it's the fire that comes, right? The fire comes and the weeds and the wheat are separated out, and the things that are on the bad side get burned up. Now, the first thing that gets burned up, Jesus says, are the causes of sin in the world. And that, to me, sounds like good news. Whatever it is that causes me to sin, that causes me to have broken relationships, that causes me to not be a saint on any given day, to say that the angels are going to come and burn all of that up, that's good news. The next part, though, is a little harder. In the translation we heard today, it says the evildoers will be gathered up and burned as well. The wording there in Greek kind of has the sense of the ones that make the things that aren't righteous, or make the opposite of righteousness. Now, righteousness is a little bit of a hazy theological concept. I tend to think of it as right relationship with God. At its roots, it's kind of a legal word, like that you're keeping the law as it's supposed to be. In a New Testament sense, we may even talk about it and saying that we are living in line with the vision of life that God has for us. And so to be righteous is to live in the ways that God has created us to live, but we also know that righteousness is really God's, and it's God's righteousness that comes through us. The very last verse says that the children of the kingdom, right, they're going to shine with this righteousness. And that one right before it, what's going to be burned up is that which makes the opposite of righteousness. That doesn't sound like good news, but if what Jesus is saying is that whatever it is in me that causes me to make the opposite of righteousness, to get out of line with God's vision for my life or for all of our collective shared life together, if whatever we do that gets in the way of that is going to get burned up, that actually does sound like good news. The other part about this fire is that this is not the first mention of fire in the Gospel of Matthew. In the 3rd chapter, when baptism is talked about, it's about water, but then it's about being baptized with fire and the Holy Spirit, and that the fire is going to burn up the chaff, burn up that waste that comes along. And so in this text, we might see that this fire could be that fire that burns up the causes of sin, burns up that which makes us do the things that are the opposite of righteousness. But it doesn't say that those who make that get thrown into the fire eternally. It just says there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And you can bet that when God's judgment comes to us, that it is something that is hard to see and feel. Maybe what happens is we see the percentage. We see the harm that we have done, and we experience the pain that we have caused. And all of that maybe then gets burned up. The next verse, though, starts with then. So the angels come, they're going to gather up the causes of sin, that which makes us do the opposite of righteousness. Then, it says, the children of the kingdom will shine with this righteousness. It's not our righteousness, it's God's. Maybe what Jesus is saying is that all of the bad is going to burn up so that all of us can shine with God's righteousness. That all of us can then be purified so that whatever test we could have would go from some percentage less than 100 up to 100% because it is God's righteousness that lives in us. And it's important for us to remember that God's righteousness does two things, right? It judges and it frees us. It judges us and it saves us. This is what we see happen with Jesus on the cross. The cross is a place where Jesus gets judged, but it is also a place where Jesus judges humanity. We recently had the death of John Lewis, a long-time fighter for civil rights in this world. If you go back to the Edmund Pettus Bridge when he and others were attacked by police and they sat down and they took that beating, that in a way was a judgment. By taking that beating, it lifted up for the world some of the systems that were wrong and bringing the opposite of righteousness into the world. And in their peaceful resistance and in their willingness to take that beating, they lifted up a judgment on the systems that were there. And that's the way the cross works. On the cross, Jesus judges the world by responding to its violence without fighting back. He judges our wrongful judgments on him by taking it. In the cross, he takes all of that brokenness and all of the opposite of righteousness onto himself, and in doing so, judges the world. But then in the resurrection comes the other side of that righteousness. It's not just judgment, it is salvation. It's where he makes us whole and gives us new life and gives us that righteousness to live. Now, as we hear this parable, and it seems to be pointed simply to the end of the age, and it may be that we can trust that God is going to come burn up all that gets between us and God and make all of us righteous so that we can shine. It's also true that there is weeping and gnashing of teeth right now in the world all around us. The parable certainly tells us that we're not going to be able to uproot all of the evil in the world without doing some harm to the good as we go along. But that doesn't mean that we can't carry God's righteousness into the world to be the ones that shine the good news that God makes us whole, to be the ones that show up and sit with those who are hurting and suffering so that they might know God's love, to believe that that righteousness doesn't just come at the end, but that it is a part of who we are now because Jesus has already been raised. That righteousness is a gift to us. It is already ours to carry. May we be blessed to go out into the world this day to carry it with us so that God's righteousness might shine in, among, and through us each and every day. Amen.